Okay. All right. Well, as luck would have it, in addition to our issue with the FCC's spectrum emission uh, intensity issue, we've also had a need to update the coordination court criteria for Part 101. Now, back in the dark ages, back in 1972, EIA published the first EIA Bulletin 10A, which addressed the issue of coordination and other interference issues with the private services. Now, those were updated in 73 and 76, and then TIA was formed and took over the management of Bulletin 10, and they published an update in 83 and 89. Well, that all seemed very well and good, but things got really crazy in the early 90s. The FCC decided to merge Part 21 and 94 to it seem perfectly reasonable to us now, but at the time you had common carrier point-to-point microwave, and you had Part 94 private systems point-to-point microwave. Well, the commission got wild and crazy, and they decided to merge those two into a new Part 101, which we all love and deal with today. But they also threw in a ringer, which was they wanted to transition the 2 gigahertz band to a new service called PCS. And the commission said, "Okay, industry, go figure out how to make all of this work." Well, that was pretty interesting. Phil Salas of Alcatel, who several of you will probably remember, uh, put together a working group to try to decide how to make all this work. You had private, excuse me, private services who were primarily analog systems. You had the common carriers who by then were trying to integrate into their digital switches. So they were using primarily digital transmission systems, and then you had these unbelievably different PCS systems, which were both point to point and multi-point systems. We had a whole mess of different kind of systems that we were trying to figure out how to deal with back in the 90s when we were trying to create TSP 90, PSP 10F. At any rate, several people got involved in that. We spent a lot of time and effort on that, and the result of that was the Bulletin 10F, which was released in 1994. Well, can you believe it? The industry moved on from 1994, and there have been a few changes, and I say that facetiously. There have been a few changes since then. Now, keep in mind, uh, TSB 10F introduced some very interesting things, including the concept of PCN or prior notification, and also the concept of T to I, and also the concept of ATPC. All of those were different. Those were new technologies and new concepts that only were introduced back in the 90s. I know all of us think they've been around since forever, but not in point of fact, they really weren't. Okay, well, we needed an update from 10F. So a group of us got together and decided to create an update to 10F. First of all, we wanted to migrate it to a standard because at that point, a bulletin was just a recommendation. A standard is basically something that you're expected to comply with if you're creating an a system that's compliant with current standards. The the 10, the bulletin 10, excuse me, I'm sorry, the standard 10, the update to 10F did a number of things, not the least of which is it introduced adaptive modulation, which didn't, of course, exist in 10F. It created some new concepts of ATPC, the most important being the ability to deal with ATPC in a rain environment. When you're dealing with systems at 11 gigahertz and higher, 11 rain is a significant issue, and the interpretation of how you should deal with that from a ATPC's perspective was not clear before we came up with the new standard. So we dealt with that. That was a significant that was a significant issue if you will remember that. There were a few interpretation issues with the standard as we originally issued it. So we got back together and spent a few years addressing those, and we have updated the standard 10 to include short antenna discrimination, as well as some of the interpretation issues with regard to adaptive coding modulation and automatic transmit power guidelines. So we believe today we have a fairly comprehensive standard that we believe addresses excuse me, we believe addresses the issues that the industry has from a coordination and a mutual interference perspective. Now, here's a sales pitch. If you would like to buy the standard, you're welcome to do that. Here's the the link that you can use to go get that. But before you get out your credit card, I would like to point out that the standard is viewable for everyone without a charge. You can go through this procedure and you can take a look at the standard and see how it applies to your environment without having to buy it. So either ways are certainly suitable. At any rate, we noticed that fixed point-to-point microwave coordination continues to evolve. It has changed a heck of a lot over the last 50 years, and I have no reason to believe that it won't continue to change. But at least for the time being, we have what we believe to be a reasonable interpretation of how we deal with mutual coordination. With that having said, Joe, I'll turn it back to you for questions.
Fantastic, George. I don't know if you were able to hear the question, George. How long did it take to do the latest TI-10 revision?
Okay, well, that's the last version. The modification of the TSA to the TIA standard took 3 years. I thought it was take 3 months. I guess I'm not very good at estimating standards time.
Einstein said if you're sitting on a match, a second feels like a year, and if you're sitting next to a pretty woman, a year feels like a second. So, time variability. Okay, so I guess the other question is, what were some of the bigger changes you think over the last 3 years through this process? Were there any, notable elements you think that stand out?
Well, the primary issue with this last change was how to deal with rain attenuation in a coordination environment. We really struggled with how to deal with that. I mean, rain will in North America. I mean, rain in all over the world is quite different, but there are two different primary forms of rain. One is a general overall rain, and that's typically what you see on the west coast of the U.S. Seattle, Portland, L.A., San Diego. There, the rain is fairly even, and it's not very intense in any particular location. However, when you get out in the when you get out the east of the Rocky Mountains and you get out to the plains where we folks like me in Dallas have to worry about, you get very intense rain cells that cause extremely intense outages, radio outages, and lots of other outages too. I don't know if you've seen what the rain's been like in the last couple of days, but we've had some pretty exciting rain here in Texas. But at any rate, if you look at the rain cells are very intense. They're so-called thunder cells that cause a very intense rain. Typically, it's about a quarter of a mile in diameter, and it will just absolutely obliterate anything that's in its area. And then you go away another half mile or so, and it's like there's no rain at all. Well, that's the deal. That's what we have to deal with in rain attenuation, and that's typical of rain in North America. So that's what we had to spend a lot of time trying to deal with to figure out how do you deal with that from an automatic transmitter power control perspective, and how do you deal with that from a coordination perspective? Because you'll get very high intensity rains in some area, and no rain attenuation out quarter mile, half mile beyond that. So yeah, I think that was probably the most interesting area that we had to deal with. And yeah, we did. I believe we dealt with that successfully, but it required some work from Doug Davies up in Canada, Rumler, Bill Rumler, a old pre AT&T Labs guy, and Tom Willis from AT&T Labs, and we had several high-powered folks dealing with that before I think we successfully found a reasonable way to deal with that. So it's a long-winded way to say I think that was the most complicated thing that we had to deal with.
Yeah, well, and we're also hearing, in the in the news that we're going to deal with more intense rain events if the meteorologists are correct with their predictive studies. So it's good that you and your colleagues developed some way for us to think about how to design our networks around that. Did we have any other questions for George? Well, seeing none, we greatly thank you, Senior Dean of Spectrum Management, George Kaiser. We all will salute you from here from Washington, D.C., and I hope you get a good happy hour down there in Dallas.
All right. Well, thanks, Joe.